Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my final verdict on the Zeiss Milvus. This is the 50mm f2 macro lens. And so about 2 years ago, I reviewed the classic version of this lens, as we're now referring to the kind of pre-Milvus lenses. And actually shortly thereafter, Zeiss launched the Milvus line. And in the first batch of 6 lenses, there were 2 lenses that had brand new optical designs, the 50mm f1.4 and then the 85mm f1.4. There were a number of other lenses, however, that had, recycled, so to speak, optical formulas. There were some tweaks and optimizations, and one of those lenses was this particular one. Now, a lot of those lenses that had similar optical formulas, I was perhaps less interested in going back and revisiting them, but I was interested in coming back to the Milvus 50mm f2 or the Makro Planar 50mm f2 because unlike most Zeiss lenses from the classic series, I actually wasn't crazy about the ergonomics of the previous classic lens, and I felt like it was on the stiff side when it came to focus, and the stiffness combined with a really long, like 330 degree focus row, made it a bit of a chore to focus, in my opinion. So I liked the images it produced, but I wasn't crazy about the ergonomics. That has been, of course, solved, and we looked at the build and the breakdown of that in this first image, or this first episode, if you want to take a look at that. And so I really do, now I'm back to I love the design of this lens. I like the ergonomics of it, and I enjoy using it. But today what we're here to do is to take a little closer look at the other aspects, including image quality, as well as a kind of my final verdict on whether or not I think that this lens is a worthy consideration since a lot of other options have come to the market. You see, when the classic Makro Planar 50mm f2 was released, optically it was pretty much at the top of the heap. A lot of other 50mm lenses were fairly soft, wide open, and while it had a smaller maximum aperture of only f2, at f2 it was still sharper than other lenses, comparative lenses, stopped down. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a bit of a visual comparison to a similar-ish type lens, and there's not a whole lot of direct competitors for this lens because of its unique, maximum magnification and et cetera, et cetera. But we'll look at a somewhat close visual comparison, and then I'll just look at some other aspects of image quality, and then we'll come back for a wrap-up and kind of my final verdict and opinion on the lens itself. So let's jump in, let's look at some images. We'll start by comparing resolution here and looking at the 2 lenses that I'm going to compare here. We have the Zeiss Milvus 50mm f2 here on the left and the Tamron 45mm on the right. Chosen the Tamron a couple of reasons. Number one, I have it on hand. Number two, it is the closest of the 50mm-ish options. Obviously 45mm is not 50mm, but as you can see here looking at the images side by side, it's not as huge difference as you might think. But secondly, the Tamron lens has what is the best maximum magnification value I know of a non-macro lens in this focal length, 0.29 times compared to the 0.50 times of the Milvus. And so in some ways, size-wise, image quality-wise, it is a competitor. Now, wide open, you can see one thing that is fairly clear. They haven't exposed the same way. And of course, we're at a little bit different aperture here, f1.8 versus f2. But you can see definitely that the Zeiss is packing a lot more contrast wide open. And of course, that is a signature Zeiss image quality aspect right there, is that amazing contrast and a lot of bite to the images. So as you can see here in the center of the frame, I definitely prefer the look that I'm getting from the Zeiss lens. It's not that it has really more resolution. It doesn't, in an absolute sense. But what it does have is more contrast. It also has less chromatic aberration, and so that shows up there. Now in the extreme corner, you can see that it does vignette more heavily than what the Tamron lens does. We can also see here in this, at least this particular corner, the Tamron looks a little bit better in that corner. If we come on down here, pretty much the same along these edges. If we look over on this side, they're more similar than what they are different. Coming down this way, the Tamron seems to lose a little bit more contrast towards the bottom right. So more similarities than differences there, but wide open, we can definitely see that there is more contrast for the Zeiss lens. Now, stop down to f2, we're going to see that the story really is the same. Now they're both at the same maximum or the same aperture of f2. And once again, however, the biggest difference here in the center of the frame is the contrast. Resolution, again, is fairly comparable, but there's definitely more contrast to be had from the Zeiss lens. Looking over to this corner again, the Tamron looks just a hair better. I don't think that there's a huge difference between f1.8 and f2 in terms of the overall resolution. I think the corner here is maybe a little bit better, but mostly this is about just seeing the comparison. Now at f2.8, we're going to see that now the Zeiss is allowing for a little bit maybe better light transmission here than what the Tamron did, and Tamron taking a little bit more exposure. But we can see, looking at this, that once again, while the gap isn't quite as wide, the Zeiss is still showing that superlative contrast, and so the darks are darker, and that's a combination of contrast and low CA. And the Tamron definitely does suffer with a little bit of CA. And so here in the corners, I think the Tamron is the better of the two lenses, and that's true in either of the two corners. So in the center of the frame, Zeiss has more punch. In the corners of the frame, the Tamron makes up for it. Stopping down to f4, we would expect to see excellent image quality from both of these lenses at f4. And we do. Once again, though, I continue to favor the Zeiss lens in terms of the contrast and the micro contrast that just gives it a little bit more visual punch to its images. Now this corner is improving, but you'll see it's not nearly as good yet as the Tamron. The Tamron is now delivering really nice looking corners, very even image quality across the frame. The Zeiss is not quite as good. However, as we move in just a little bit from the edges of the frame, like in this area here, once again, the Zeiss superiority is shown there. Now here at f5.6, the Tamron is the closest to what I've seen in terms of matching the contrast of the Zeiss. Though once again, I still do prefer just slightly what I'm seeing from the Zeiss lens in terms of that contrast, micro contrast. Corner is starting to look better now on the Zeiss lens. Again, still not Tamron good, but corners now at f5.6 are looking pretty good. And so if you're wanting to shoot this lens, say for landscape purposes, probably f5.6 and f8 are going to be your optimal apertures for that. Now stopping the lens down and kind of putting some backlighting into the frame exposes one of the optical shortcomings of the lens, in that it is a bit flare prone. And frankly, it's kind of surprising in that it comes with quite a deep lens hood, but beyond that, the front element itself is really recessed in the lens. And so I'm just kind of surprised that it struggles as much with flare resistance as it does. But as you can see, some big ghosting patterns here. This stopped down to f11, so we can see the nice blades of the aperture there, 9-bladed aperture. And there is also this little blob here. That being said, as far as breaking down, this isn't terrible in terms of the kind of the aesthetic quality. And so, however, if we were to move things out and open the lens up to f2, you can see here that kind of doing the same kind of shot, sun in the frame, it's a lot more disruptive, particularly in this area right here. And so that's certainly something you need to watch for. Similarly here, while I do think that there's artistic merit for an image like this, kind of the veiling all across the frame, it's kind of a cool effect. However, it still is an optical defect. However, note that I shot the similar scene, and really all that I've done here is I just repositioned to where the sun was out of the frame. You can just see here the positioning of these leaves. I've just moved enough to where the sun is out of the frame, and you'll see what a huge difference that makes. And so, there's kind of the word to the wise. You have two artistic options here. If you put the sun in the frame or you don't have any choice, expect some veiling. But if you can position the sun out of the frame like here, you can get a, still a backlit result and a really beautiful result. And of course the image sharpness here, there's lots of bite and detail there in the center of the frame. Now in terms of examining that bokeh quality, just run through a quick series here as we stop down the aperture. So wide open f2, let's just take a look at the circle here. You can see, kind of the reason for that very nice bokeh quality. It's just very, very smooth center of the frame. Kind of reminds me of the Milvus 85mm f1.4. A very soft transition inner line there. And so quality of the actual defocus is really nice. Yes, you are going to get some cat eye or lemon shape, which is entirely common for this. Stopping down to f2.8, we're going to see kind of a more even circular shape. And you can see, a slight bit of nonagonal from the aperture, but, it's still highly circular. Stopping down to now to f4, again, there's still a little bit more of the nonagonal shape, but at the same time, now you have a very even, circular-ish shape. And while there's a little bit more busyness creeping in, this is still quite a smooth result at that. And stopping on down to f8. Now, the shapes are a little bit less circular, and of course there's a little bit of a harder inner edge, but the center of the bokeh circles is actually still quite quite smooth for a lens stop down. And of course you've got, great detail. Look at that detail rendered right there. I mean, that's just fantastic. This is on a Canon 5D Mark IV. Now this gives you an idea of just kind of the general quality of the rendering, clear, or kind of closer to macro distances. And so, some nice detail there. You are going to see just a little bit in kind of the transition to out of focus areas, just a little bit of green fringing, but it's not really all that disruptive. And the image, look at the whole, you look at that kind of out of focus quality, it's really, really nice. Here moving out to, more like a 4 or 5 foot distance. Once again, we've got, a really great amount of detail and contrast on our subject. I mean, that looks fantastic there. But then the image as a whole, it really quite artistic rendering. So that's definitely a strength of the lens. It has a nice, bokeh quality in rendering. Stop down, I think that this is a gorgeous macro, landscape lens. It renders, of course, very nice detail across the frame. It has excellent contrast, as noted. And it has very low distortion. And so that makes it really quite a nice, just kind of general purpose landscape lens. So once again here, this is at f5.6. If you're just wanting to have really nice, detail and color rendition, it's hard to beat a Zeiss for this kind of image just because you get such great contrast and detail rendering. And the images themselves just have a really pleasing quality to them. Now, just taking a quick look here in terms of distortion, you can see that the native distortion of the lens is really very, very, very low. There's probably just a tiny bit of some barrel distortion right there, but it is it's minute, and so as you'd expect from a macro lens, and so a good quality there. You can definitely see as we look down towards the edge, compared to the center of the frame, there's definitely some vignette that is there. There's about 2.5 stops in the extreme corners, and so stopping it down is going to eliminate that. But as you can also see here, at f2, there's a lot of great contrast on our subject, and so a good result there nonetheless. That low distortion definitely helps if you're going to do some panoramas. This is actually a handheld panorama shot that I did, just a side of the road, and I took 4 vertical frames and combined them together in this image. As you can see, really nice end result there. Great detail, and the fact that the distortion is so low makes them stitch quite nicely. And this is a technique that I personally really like because you get a little bit more manageable, a final ratio with shooting with the vertical images as opposed to shooting multiple horizontal images. So I really like the lens for that as well. Here's another f5.6, just using it, as a kind of a general purpose lens. I really like the color rendering here. I like the detail, I like the contrast. I mean, bottom line, this lens produces really nice images. And of course, here you've got some creative options due to having that large maximum aperture. And so, a couple of takes, say, to this shot, where I can, compose to where I've got, going up the steps towards the building in focus, and I have a really defocused foreground. Then I can flip that around to where I can tell the story in a completely different way, with the focus here on the path, first steps, and then the building itself in defocus. And this area here is an area that, just from experience, I can tell you is be very prone towards a lot of busyness. And overall, this is actually handled quite nicely, and so it's not distracting. Shooting once again here closer to macro distances. I mean, this is a macro lens, and so it does this kind of thing very well. It is only a 1 to 2 magnification. We'll look at that in just a second. But detail at minimum focus is as you would expect. It's excellent. Wide open contrast, excellent. And so that allows you to just, have versatility in what you're going to shoot, how you're going to shoot it, and so I find that a lens like this, I can go out with it and I can come home with a huge variety of images. Now this shows you what it's going to produce at full magnification here. And so this is right at minimum focus. This is as close as you can get. So, the actual detail that the lens can render is very nice. This is the lens cap from the lens itself. But I just wanted to show you basically how much of the frame you can fill with, say an object like this, the lens cap itself. Now, just for the fun of it, I threw it onto a Sony a6500. So that allowed me to do two things. Of course, number one, it allowed me to look at it on APS-C. So Sony has a 1.5 times crop factor. It also gave me the option of just seeing how the lens would handle on a smaller body like that. And while there is some weight and heft to it, it still is within the range to where it's not a bad balance. And so it's a combination I think I would use if I own the lens. Wide open here, f2, we can see that it's surviving the transition to APS-C just fine. Defocus area looks fine, and detail looks fine. Here's another example here just to show you the quality of our bokeh is still very good, and our detail that's rendered on APS-C is still very good here. And here we have a chance to look even towards the very edge of the frame, and we're still getting nice detail there on that. And so ultimately, I think that this is a lens that you can use on either full frame or APS-C and get very good results. And of course, on APS-C like this, you'll see that the vignette is essentially completely eliminated, and so you get a very nice end result. So as you can see, this lens is still very capable of producing some gorgeous images. And in fact, I really do like the images that come off of the lens itself. Problem being in one sense that I think that the Milvus 50mm f1.4's rendering is just as good, if not better. But they're kind of two different lenses in that the 50mm f1.4, it doesn't really have any kind of true magnification qualities at all. And so if you're looking for a more versatile lens and also a more compact lens, and you don't mind manual focusing, these Makro Planar lenses are really some of the most versatile tools that you can have in your kit. They just do a lot of things well. And as you can see, you can jump from doing, macro type images at a 1 to 2 life-size magnification out to doing landscape images and, pretty much everything in between. It's just a really great focal length, of course, and it's a very versatile lens. And so I do think that it still has merit, of course, but as we also see, the optical quality is no longer, easily at the top of the heap. There are some good competitors if you're looking just really at image sharpness. And of course, since, that point, the Otis 55mm f1.4 has come out, and it is superb. There's also very sharp options like the Sigma 50mm f1.4 art, and and even the Tamron that I used as a comparison point here. There are some lenses that are optically, probably just as good in some senses. But if you're a fan of Zeiss color and that amazing wide open contrast, then I think that this lens is still a very, very intriguing one. Of course, like Zeiss lenses, it's an expensive alternative, and the price tag is right under $1,300 US, and so in a Zeiss sense, that makes it in the the lower half of the less expensive Zeiss options, but it's certainly in an absolute sense, it's not an inexpensive lens. And of course, it's manual focus only, and not everyone is willing to kind of cope with that, or to deal with those additional challenges. But at the same time, if you're not off-put by either of those things, the nice thing about this lens, and the reason why I was intrigued at looking at it again, is if it handled well, which it does, it's small enough, compact enough that it can be used on a couple of different systems. And I did like it as an alternative on, say, like a mirrorless system, the Sony a6500, and I think it would also be very intriguing on like a Sony, A7 series. And so that's, I think, an application that a lot of people should consider, since manual focus is less of a deal on some of these mirrorless systems that have better manual focusing aids as a part of them. So all in all, I think that this is still a very valid option for those of you that are looking for kind of an ultimately versatile lens. And having this kind of magnification and image quality at 50mm is still pretty special. If you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to the image gallery from this particular lens, and beyond that, you can find buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. I'm Dustin Abbott, and you can also follow me on social media, become one of my patrons. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.